Let's keep this quiet. That's what my brother said outside the courthouse on Monday, his voice clipped, his hand tightening briefly on my arm as though to remind me who still believed he held control. The air smelled faintly of old stone and car exhaust, a mix that always lingers around county buildings, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that it carried the weight of too many secrets pressed into the mortar of those walls. I didn't look at him when I reached into my bag and slid my thumb across the side of my phone, opening the voice recorder. The faint red dot pulsed back at me like a heartbeat, steady, silent, unseen. My calm face betrayed nothing, but inside, my blood moved differently, slow, heavy, carrying the gravity of years I had swallowed in silence. I stood there, staring at the courthouse steps, the granite worn down by decades of feet, of people like me who had come to fight for some scrap of fairness, some acknowledgement that what they endured was real. My brother tugged at his tie, restless. He was always restless when he felt cornered. His words were not a suggestion, they were an instruction, the same kind he had been issuing since we were children. Do not speak. Do not tell. Do not make things harder. He wore authority like a suit, one he never removed, even in private. I used to shrink under it. But that day, standing with the recorder quietly running in my bag, I felt something shift, just slightly. It was the way he said quiet that cut me. As if my voice was a threat. As if truth itself was dangerous, something that must be contained for the family's sake. I had heard it before, in smaller ways. Years ago, when I tried to bring up the account discrepancies after our father's funeral, he said, "Don't start trouble." When I noticed our mother's jewelry vanishing, pawn slips tucked away in his jacket, he said, "You don't need to know everything." And when I asked why he had rewritten parts of the will before our father's hands had even stiffened, he told me, "Stop asking questions that hurt people." Each time, I obeyed. I let silence settle in, the way dust settles over furniture no one touches anymore. But silence corrodes. It eats away at you slowly, until you wake up one morning realizing that even your own reflection seems muted, like it belongs to someone else. I had grown tired of watching my own life blur. Tired of feeling smaller than the truth I carried. So when he leaned in and murmured those 4 words outside the courthouse, something inside me refused. I would not keep this quiet. Not anymore. I remember the cold January wind cutting through my coat as the courthouse doors opened. People filed past us, shuffling papers, murmuring about hearings and depositions. My brother walked ahead of me, confident, his polished shoes striking sharp against the pavement. He always moved as if the ground owed him steadiness. I followed a few paces behind, my mind spinning in quiet circles. The recorder hummed silently in my bag, capturing footsteps, the scrape of his throat, the momentary click of his pen as he rehearsed his performance. Inside, the walls smelled of wax and disinfectant. I've always found courthouses uncanny, so many lives reduced to case numbers, stories trimmed to fit into neat, procedural lines. It felt cruel, how emotion is forced into a frame too small to hold it. And yet, here I was, about to place my family's fracture into the hands of strangers. I wondered if they would see me as fragile, dramatic, perhaps even bitter. I wondered if they would believe him, with his tailored calm and well-rehearsed pauses. We sat outside the hearing room, a wooden bench beneath us, the varnish worn thin by nervous hands. He tapped his foot in a rhythm that once comforted me as a child, when storms rattled the windows and I slipped into his room to hear that steady beat. Back then, I thought it meant safety. Now, it only reminded me how far we had drifted, how much of his rhythm was built on keeping me beneath his heel. I looked at his profile, sharp nose, the faint scar near his temple from when he fell off his bike at 12. I remembered pressing a washcloth to his wound while he whimpered, and our mother scolding me for not stopping him sooner. That scar had always seemed like proof of our bond. But bonds fray. Blood ties do not prevent betrayal, sometimes they embolden it. He leaned toward me, lowering his voice. "This doesn't help anyone. You know that, right?" His words were smooth, reasonable, as though logic should replace the ache in my chest. I didn't answer. Instead, I pressed my palm against my bag where the phone lay, still recording. A strange calm washed through me, the kind that comes when you realize the fear that's bound you can finally loosen. When the clerk called our names, my brother rose quickly, shoulders squared, his suit jacket falling perfectly into place. I rose more slowly, feeling the weight of years on my back, yet also the faint, unfamiliar lift of defiance. We walked into the room together, but I knew we no longer stood on the same side of anything. The hearing itself was a blur of voices, legal terms, and shuffling papers. My attorney spoke in careful tones, measured but steady. My brother countered with the same ease he had used to charm teachers, employers, even lovers. His words wove around the truth like ivy, wrapping it until it nearly disappeared. But every lie he told, every omission he painted as fact, settled into my recorder, time-stamped and preserved. For once, he could not erase what he said. When we left the room, his face was tight, the mask slipping just enough for me to glimpse the boy underneath, the one terrified of losing control. He didn't speak as we walked down the corridor. Only when we stepped into the gray daylight again did he stop, his hand briefly gripping my elbow. "I told you," he muttered, "keeping things quiet keeps families together." I looked at him then, really looked. The man who once held my hand across crosswalks, who taught me to ride a bike, who promised at our father's graveside that we'd take care of each other. And I saw how those promises had rotted under the weight of greed, secrecy, and fear. I pulled my arm away gently, no force, just distance. On the bus ride home, the city slid past the window, shops closing for the evening, children tugging on their mother's coats, a man carrying a bag of groceries that split open on the curb. Life, ordinary and indifferent. I sat with my bag on my lap, the phone still recording though I had forgotten to stop it. Its red pulse glowed faintly, reflecting in the window. Proof that I had not stayed silent this time. Proof that a line had been drawn, even if the world hadn't yet noticed. That night, in my kitchen, I brewed tea the way I always do when the weight of the day lingers too heavily. The steam curled up, carrying the scent of chamomile. I thought about his words, "Keep this quiet." I rolled them around in my mind, the way you do with something bitter you can't yet spit out. Quiet had never protected me. Quiet had only shielded him. I sat at the table, sipping slowly, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. The house felt too empty, too aware of its silence. But this silence was different. It wasn't imposed. It wasn't demanded. It was mine. For the first time, silence felt like space, not a cage. As I reached to turn off the recorder at last, I whispered to myself, not for him, not even for the courts, but for me, no more quiet. The words hung in the air, fragile yet real. And as I switched off the glowing red, I felt something begin to loosen inside me, something that had been clenched for far too long. When I woke the next morning, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the kind my brother demanded, but the natural quiet of a house still folded in sleep. Pale light came through the curtains, brushing faint patterns across the wall. I stayed in bed longer than usual, listening to the pipes shift, the faint murmur of a neighbor's radio. It was a small thing, lying there, but it felt rebellious. For years I had moved too quickly, rushing from task to task, carrying everyone else's demands like a bundle on my back. That morning, I let myself linger. The events of the courthouse replayed in my mind like an old film reel, scratches and all. My brother's voice, low and commanding. The click of my recorder. The way his eyes darted when he realized I would not yield to his quiet. These images layered over older memories, sharper ones. Like the time when I was 15 and caught him taking bills from our father's wallet, his face hardening as he pressed a finger to his lips, signaling me to stay silent. Or the summer when our mother's bracelets began disappearing from her dresser and he told me she must have misplaced them. I had wanted to believe him, but even then, the unease settled into me like dust in the lungs. People like to think betrayal comes in big gestures, dramatic revelations. In my experience, it's quieter than that. It arrives in the small, steady denials that wear you down. The silences. The "you must have imagined it." The "don't make this harder." By the time you realize how deep it runs, you've already surrendered years of your own voice. I carried these thoughts with me to the kitchen. The kettle's whistle cut through the stillness, and I poured hot water over a tea bag, watching the amber seep and curl. My father used to drink tea every morning, sitting at the head of the table with the newspaper open. He was a man of rituals, of routines, and perhaps that was why I had always believed him steady. But even rituals cannot stop illness. Cancer hollowed him quickly, and in those last months, my brother took over the paperwork, the accounts, the phone calls. He said he was sparing me the burden. At the time, I was grateful. Only later did I realize what doors that burden had opened for him. I sat with my tea, tracing the chipped rim of the mug with my finger, remembering the day of our father's funeral. The house had been full of relatives, their voices low and respectful, though their eyes often flicked toward the mahogany cabinet where the will was locked. My brother had ushered me into the den, the documents already spread across the desk. He had spoken with such confidence, about assets, about transfers, about what father would have wanted. I had been too raw with grief to question him. When I stumbled across different versions of the documents weeks later, he said my memory was clouded by mourning. I believed him because believing him hurt less than suspecting the truth. But truth has a way of waiting. It doesn't disappear just because you lock it away. It waits in the cracks of conversations, in the odd gaps of memory, in the objects that vanish when you aren't looking. It waits until you are strong enough, or desperate enough, to open your eyes. That morning, after the courthouse, I finally opened mine wider. I pulled the recorder from my bag and replayed a few minutes of the file. My brother's voice filled the kitchen, smooth as ever. "Let's keep this quiet." Hearing it played back made something inside me clench and release all at once. For years, I had tried to convince myself that maybe I had misunderstood him, that maybe I was too sensitive. But there it was, captured and undeniable. My whole life, people told me memory was fallible, that feelings could exaggerate. But recordings? They do not bend to someone else's version of events. I saved the file carefully, labeling it with the date. My fingers shook as I typed, though whether from fear or resolve I couldn't tell. Then I opened a new folder on my computer and titled it Truth. It felt both terrifying and liberating, as though I had just cracked open a door that had long been bolted shut. Throughout the day, my mind wandered back through the years, threading old moments together with new clarity. I thought of the holidays when my brother insisted on hosting, only to present everything as his achievement while I scurried in the background, cooking, cleaning, managing the small details. He'd raise a glass, make a toast, and I'd smile, even as exhaustion pressed into my bones. I thought of how he handled our mother's decline, placing her in a facility without discussing it with me, then telling everyone I had agreed. When I questioned him privately, he said, "You didn't need the stress." What he meant was, I didn't want the interference. These memories layered over each other, not with sudden anger but with a slow, simmering recognition. Betrayal rarely erupts, it seeps. And once you notice the seepage, you can't unsee the stains it leaves. That evening, I decided to take a walk. The winter air was sharp, biting at my cheeks, but I welcomed it. Movement has always helped me think. As I walked past familiar houses, lights glowing in windows, I found myself wondering how many other people carried their own quiet betrayals, tucked away like folded letters. How many sat across dinner tables, smiling politely while swallowing truths too jagged to share. It struck me then that silence wasn't unique to my family, it was a currency many families used to buy a fragile peace. But peace built on silence is brittle. It cracks under pressure, and when it does, it cuts. I passed the small park where my brother and I used to play as children. The swings stood empty, their chains rattling faintly in the wind. I remembered the way he used to push me higher, shouting, "You can fly if you don't look down." I had trusted him then, had believed his voice was one of encouragement rather than control. How strange, to stand decades later, realizing that even those words carried a hint of foreshadowing. Don't look down. Don't look too closely. Don't ask questions. Keep soaring, but only on the path he chose. By the time I returned home, the stars had started to pierce the sky. I unlocked the door, slipped off my gloves, and felt an unexpected steadiness. Not strength exactly, but the early roots of it. Like the way green shoots push through hard soil, fragile yet determined. Inside, I made myself write. I pulled out a notebook I hadn't touched in years and began scribbling memories, dates, details. Small things at first, the missing jewelry, the altered signatures, the phrases he used to keep me silent. Once I started, the words poured out. My handwriting was messy, uneven, but I didn't care. The act of writing felt like reclaiming pieces of myself I had abandoned. Hours passed without my noticing. When I finally set the pen down, my hand ached, but my chest felt lighter. The notebook lay thick with pages, a testament to truths I had carried alone for too long. Looking at it, I realized that even if no one else ever read it, even if the courts never cared, I had created a record that could not be silenced. Sleep came fitfully that night. I dreamed of our childhood home, of standing in the hallway with my ear pressed to the door of my brother's room. I heard whispers inside, his voice, others' voices, plotting, planning, laughing at secrets I wasn't allowed to share. I woke with my heart pounding, but instead of fear, I felt anger. Anger that I had lived so much of my life in the shadow of someone else's secrecy. The next morning, as I made breakfast, I looked out the window and saw frost on the grass, glittering in the early sun. It struck me as both beautiful and fragile, how something so delicate could coat the ground so completely. Secrets are like that too, I thought, fragile, yet covering everything until the sun of truth warms the ground enough to melt them. I poured myself coffee and sat at the table, staring at the steam curling upward. I thought of my brother's words outside the courthouse, his insistence on quiet. And I realized something: quiet had been his weapon, but it could also be my shield. Not silence, but quiet. The kind of quiet you hold inside while you prepare, while you gather strength. The kind of quiet that isn't surrender but strategy. That realization stayed with me all day, humming beneath my skin like a secret of my own. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the powerless sibling trailing behind. I felt like someone waiting. Watching. Writing. Recording. And in that waiting, I began to sense the faint outline of a different kind of life, one where my voice mattered, where truth wasn't buried, where the past could be faced without fear. I didn't yet know what steps I would take, or how the battle would unfold. But I knew this much: the silence my brother demanded was broken. And once broken, silence can never be repaired in the same way. It echoes differently. It carries new weight. It belongs not to the one who imposed it, but to the one who finally chose to end it. And that, I thought as I closed my notebook that evening, was a beginning. Not a loud one, not dramatic. But a beginning all the same. The following week blurred with small, deliberate choices that might have looked ordinary to anyone else but felt monumental to me. I started by carrying my recorder everywhere. It became almost like a talisman, tucked in my bag or my coat pocket, a quiet reminder that my truth could no longer be erased. Each time I felt doubt press in, those familiar whispers telling me I was overreacting, I would touch the device and feel steadier. One afternoon, I called the nursing facility where our mother lived. My brother had managed most of the communication with the staff for years, always positioning himself as the responsible one, the one who knew best. I had accepted that distance, believing I didn't have the right questions, or that perhaps I was too emotional to manage the details. But when the receptionist answered and transferred me to the director, I heard myself speaking with a clarity that surprised me. I asked about billing records, visitation logs, and changes in her treatment plan. There was a pause on the other end, perhaps unused to my directness, but then the answers came, straightforward, factual. I wrote everything down in my notebook. When I hung up, I stared at the pages, at the simple inked facts, and felt an ache in my chest. How many years had I let pass without asking? How many truths had I surrendered because it was easier to let my brother play gatekeeper? The thought stung, but it also lit something inside me. I wasn't too late. I was here now, asking, listening, recording. That evening, I visited our mother. She was sitting in a chair by the window, her hair thinner than I remembered, her eyes watery but still sharp when they found mine. She smiled faintly, reaching for my hand. "You don't come often," she said softly. The words landed heavy. I wanted to defend myself, to explain how my brother had managed the visits, how I was made to feel like a guest instead of a daughter. But excuses felt empty in the face of her loneliness. I simply squeezed her hand and said, "I'm here now." We sat in silence for a long time, watching the late sun spread gold across the lawn. It struck me how much life had shrunk for her, her world measured by meals, nurse check-ins, and the angle of light through the window. I wondered if she knew about the missing jewelry, the accounts drained, the subtle theft threaded through the years. Maybe she knew and chose quiet, the same way I had. Or maybe she didn't know at all, and silence had been chosen for her. On the drive home, I cried, not loud, wrenching sobs, but the slow, steady kind that slips down your face almost unnoticed. I wasn't just mourning her decline. I was mourning the years I had surrendered to someone else's version of our family story. My brother had been writing the script for so long, I had forgotten I could take the pen back. The next day, I did something that felt even more defiant. I scheduled a meeting with a lawyer, not the one who had represented me at the courthouse, but someone new, someone unconnected to the old dynamics. Sitting in that office, explaining my suspicions about altered documents and financial manipulation, I felt exposed. Part of me feared I would be dismissed again, told that memory is unreliable, that grief distorts perception. But the lawyer listened carefully, took notes, and finally said, "If what you're saying is accurate, there are avenues to pursue." The words lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. For years, I had been told to stay quiet because speaking up would break the family, would cause irreparable harm. But harm had already been done, quietly, steadily, behind closed doors. Acknowledging it didn't create the fracture, it simply revealed it. That night, I called my brother. My hand shook as I held the phone, but I pressed the record button before he answered. His voice came through cheerful, practiced. "Everything's fine," he said after a few pleasantries, "you don't need to worry about anything." "I'm not worried," I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness in my tone. "I'm paying attention." There was silence on the line, a pause long enough to feel heavy. Then his voice sharpened, low and clipped. "What exactly are you trying to do?" "Just making sure things are clear," I said. My words were simple, but behind them was a shift, one I knew he could sense. He no longer held all the quiet. I had claimed some of it back, and in that quiet, I held power. After the call ended, I sat with the recording, listening to the tremor in his voice, the irritation he couldn't disguise. For the first time, I saw fear in him, not fear of me, but of exposure. And that realization steadied me more than anything else had. The days that followed were filled with small acts of defiance. I visited our mother without telling him. I asked questions directly of the staff. I sorted through old boxes in my attic, uncovering letters and receipts that painted a clearer picture of years past. Each discovery was like a puzzle piece clicking into place. Painful, yes, but also affirming. One evening, as I sifted through a box of my father's old papers, I found a letter in his handwriting. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just notes about family responsibilities, written shortly before his illness worsened. At the bottom, in shaky script, he had written, "Make sure both children are cared for equally." I stared at the line until my eyes blurred. My father's last wish had been equality, fairness. Yet here we were, years later, with one sibling carrying truth in silence and the other twisting it into his own advantage. I folded the paper carefully, placing it between the pages of my notebook. It felt like a message across time, a quiet affirmation that I wasn't imagining things, that I wasn't wrong to push back. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months. Not because everything was resolved, far from it, but because I no longer felt alone in my truth. I carried my father's words with me, written proof that fairness had always been the intention. My brother could try to erase, to silence, to manipulate. But some truths linger, stubborn as ink on paper. And as I drifted into sleep, I thought again of the recorder, of the red pulse that had become my companion. My brother wanted silence. What he didn't realize was that I had learned to make silence work for me. And in that quiet space, I was slowly, steadily, finding my voice. The closer we moved toward resolution, the more my brother tried to pull me back into the old rhythm of silence. His calls came more often now, his voice shifting between charm and command. One night he said, almost casually, "You don't want to drag this out, do you? Families fall apart when people refuse to let things go." His words should have stung, but they only revealed how rattled he had become. For once, he sounded less like a man in control and more like someone afraid of losing it. I sat at my kitchen table, the phone on speaker, my notebook open. I wrote down every word he said, my pen scratching steadily while he spoke. At one point, he caught on and demanded, "Are you writing this down?" "Yes," I replied calmly. The silence that followed stretched long, taut. Then he laughed, hollow, brittle. "You've changed," he said. I didn't answer, but he was right. I had changed. Or maybe I had simply remembered who I was before silence reshaped me. That weekend, I visited our mother again. She was more frail than the week before, her eyes cloudier, but when I held her hand, she squeezed mine with surprising strength. "Your father always trusted you," she murmured, her words drifting like mist. I swallowed hard. She had said similar things before, but never so directly. I wanted to ask her if she knew what my brother had done, if she suspected how much had been stolen, not just money, but trust, years, the very fabric of our family. But she was too tired, and I couldn't bring myself to weigh her down with my suspicions. Instead, I just whispered back, "I know." Walking out of that facility, I realized that what I sought wasn't just justice in legal terms. It was restoration of self. I couldn't undo what my brother had taken, but I could refuse to let him take any more. That distinction mattered. A few nights later, he showed up at my house unannounced. The knock was sharp, impatient. When I opened the door, the cold air rushed in with him. He didn't wait to be invited, he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room as though searching for evidence. "We need to stop this," he said immediately. "It's gone too far." I watched him pace my living room, his suit jacket still buttoned as if he had come straight from some meeting where he had been respected, obeyed. Here, though, he looked smaller, his gestures tighter, his words less certain. "You're destroying the family," he accused, turning to face me. "No," I said quietly. "I'm ending the silence that destroyed it long ago." The words surprised even me, but once spoken, they felt immovable. He sneered, but his eyes betrayed him, flickers of fear darting like shadows. "Do you really think anyone will believe you? You've always been," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "emotional." There it was again, the old weapon. Emotional. As if feeling deeply disqualified me from speaking truth. As if calm cruelty held more authority than trembling honesty. I felt the anger rise, but instead of lashing out, I simply reached into my bag and placed the recorder on the table. The red light blinked once, steady. His face hardened. "So that's how it's going to be?" "Yes," I said. My voice was steady, though my heart pounded. "That's how it's going to be." We stood in silence for a long moment, the kind of silence that once would have suffocated me. But now it felt different. It wasn't his silence. It was mine. He left without another word, the door slamming behind him. I sank into a chair, shaking, the adrenaline coursing through me. It wasn't triumph I felt, not exactly. It was something quieter, heavier, but real. For the first time, I hadn't backed down. I hadn't swallowed my voice. And that mattered more than anything. In the days that followed, I thought often about what my brother said, that families fall apart when people refuse to let things go. Maybe he was right, in a way. Families built on silence do fall apart when someone decides to break it. But maybe that collapse is necessary, like a crumbling wall that must give way before anything new can be built. I began to imagine a life beyond this struggle, not defined by it but shaped by what I had learned. A life where my days weren't haunted by the weight of unspoken truths. I didn't know what that life would look like yet, but I knew it began with moments like these, standing firm, refusing to shrink, choosing my own quiet instead of his. One night, I took out my father's letter again, the one where he had written about caring for both children equally. I read it slowly, my fingers tracing the shaky ink. He hadn't left instructions for silence. He hadn't asked me to carry betrayal like a stone in my chest. He had asked for fairness, for care. It was my brother who had twisted that wish into a weapon. And it was me who had to untangle it, even if it cost me the version of family I once clung to. As I folded the letter, I felt a strange peace settle over me. Not because the battle was over, but because I finally understood that the outcome mattered less than the act of standing in truth. My brother could smear my name, dismiss me as emotional, even win in the eyes of the court. But he could not force me back into silence. That power was gone. For the first time in years, I felt something close to freedom. It didn't roar or blaze. It was quiet, almost fragile. But it was mine. After my brother left my house that night, the silence stretched thick around me. The slam of the door still vibrated faintly in the floorboards, but slowly it gave way to something steadier. I sat for a long time in the quiet, the recorder still on the table, its red eye blinking as if to remind me that truth had been witnessed. Not just by the device, but by me. The days that followed felt strangely lighter. Not easy, there were still lawyers to call, documents to review, visits to my mother that grew more painful as her health slipped, but lighter, in a way that surprised me. I had expected confrontation to weigh me down, but instead it seemed to clear the air. The shadows in which my brother had moved so confidently no longer held the same power. Once light has been let in, even a small beam, darkness never feels the same. I kept writing. Each night, I added to the notebook dates, memories, fragments of conversations that surfaced unexpectedly. The act of putting them down gave me back pieces of myself I didn't know were missing. Sometimes I would read back through the pages and marvel at how much I had kept locked inside. It was as though my whole life had been rehearsing silence, and now I was learning a new language, one that translated grief into testimony, fear into evidence, confusion into clarity. My mother's decline became my anchor. Every visit reminded me why I was doing this. I would sit beside her bed, smoothing the blanket across her lap, and think about how many decisions had been made without her knowledge, without her consent. She had deserved more. I had deserved more. We both had. She rarely spoke in full sentences anymore, but her hand in mine spoke enough. Each squeeze felt like a reminder that I was not invisible, not wrong to remember, not wrong to resist. One afternoon, as I was leaving the facility, one of the nurses stopped me. She glanced around, as if making sure no one was listening, then said quietly, "Your brother is difficult. He doesn't like being questioned. But you're doing right by her." The words stunned me. For so long, I had been told I was difficult, that I complicated things, that my questions harmed rather than helped. Hearing those words from a stranger, a professional who had no stake in our family's fragile balance, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. I thanked her, blinking back tears as I stepped into the cold. I thought of that moment often, especially as my brother grew more agitated. He stopped calling as frequently, perhaps realizing his words were being captured, perhaps realizing charm alone could no longer bend me. When we did speak, his tone was sharper, edged with something I had never heard before, desperation. He had always held control as though it was his birthright. Now, cracks were showing. And yet, even as I began to feel stronger, I also felt grief creeping in around the edges. Not grief for him, not anymore, but for the family we might have been, had honesty not been poisoned by secrecy. I mourned the brother who once held my hand on the swings, who once promised we'd face the world together. That version of him was gone, if he had ever truly existed. The realization cut deep. Breaking silence freed me, but it also confirmed a truth I had long resisted. Sometimes, you don't lose family through distance or time. You lose them when you finally see them clearly. The legal process continued slowly, as it always does. Meetings, filings, questions from lawyers that seemed to circle the same points again and again. I learned to steady myself during those sessions, to breathe slowly when doubt tried to seep back in. I remembered the recorder. I remembered my father's note. I remembered my mother's hand in mine. These small anchors became my foundation. One evening, after a particularly draining meeting, I took another walk through the park where my brother and I had played as children. The swings squeaked faintly in the wind, the ground frozen hard. I sat down on one of the swings, feeling the cold chain bite into my hands, and let myself remember. Not just the good memories, but the truth of them, the way joy and control had always intertwined, the way I had been taught to confuse silence with loyalty. Sitting there, I realized I no longer needed to untangle it. I could let the memories exist as they were, flawed, complicated, imperfect. I didn't need to rewrite them. I only needed to stop letting them define me. The wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of smoke from a nearby chimney. I closed my eyes and whispered, "No more quiet." The words felt different now than when I first said them weeks earlier in my kitchen. Then, they had been fragile, a plea. Now, they were firm, a vow. In the months that followed, I built new rituals. Small things, but they mattered. I brewed tea each morning and drank it slowly, without rushing into the day. I called the facility regularly, not waiting for updates but asking directly. I wrote letters to myself, reminders of what I had survived, what I had claimed back. These acts might have seemed insignificant, but they were stitches, binding me back together piece by piece. Eventually, the hearing reached a point where both sides had spoken their truths. My brother sat across from me in that sterile room, his suit as sharp as ever, but his confidence dulled. He looked at me with a mix of anger and something else, recognition, perhaps, that I was no longer the sister who obeyed. The judge's voice droned, papers shuffled, but I kept my gaze steady. I didn't need to win in the way he defined winning. I only needed to stand, to speak, to refuse silence. And that, I had done. Afterward, outside the courthouse, I lingered on the steps. The sky was gray, heavy with the promise of snow. People rushed past me, their lives carrying them in 100 different directions, but I stood still, breathing in the cold. I thought back to the first day, when my brother had said, "Let's keep this quiet." I had obeyed for years before that moment, swallowing truth until it nearly swallowed me. But not anymore. I reached into my bag, pulled out the recorder, and for the first time in months, I turned it off. Not because I was giving up, but because I no longer needed it as proof. The proof I needed most was inside me, written across every choice I had made since that Monday morning. That night, I returned home and set the recorder on the shelf above my desk. I made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my notebook. The pages were thick now, filled with cramped handwriting, ink smudges, notes and dates that stitched together a map of truth. I flipped through them slowly, feeling the weight of all I had carried and all I had released. When I reached the last blank page, I paused, pen in hand. Instead of writing another memory, I wrote a single sentence: "I am not quiet anymore." I closed the notebook gently, as if sealing something sacred. The house was still, the night pressing in soft against the windows. I sipped my tea and let the quiet settle, but this time it was different. It was no longer the silence of suppression, but the quiet of peace. The kind you choose, the kind that belongs to you. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I thought of my mother, of her fading voice, of her hand squeezing mine. I thought of my father's shaky script, his wish for fairness. And I thought of the child I once was, swinging in the park, believing my brother's words that I could fly if I didn't look down. Now, older and steadier, I finally understood, I didn't need to look down or up. I only needed to look forward. And so I did.